In the previous level, we talked about unemployment, and you looked at what was happening with the unemployment rate. Now let's look at how we fix the unemployment problem. So if the unemployment rate is high, what do we do about it? And the solution to a high unemployment really determines what school of thought you fall into in economics. There's the classical economist, there's the Keynesian economist, and there's the supply-siders. So we're going to look at these three different schools of thought and the approach that they have to solving high unemployment. The predominant theory of how to solve unemployment from essentially 1776 with Adam Smith all the way up until the Great Depression in the late 1920s was the classical view. During the Great Depression, when the classical view didn't seem to be solving the problem, along came the Keynesian view. And that became the predominant theory, and it's still used quite a bit today. A third option arose after the stagflation of the 1970s, and so really had its heyday in the early 80s, and that's the supply side view. So we're going to look at each of these three and the differences between them, when they worked and when they didn't. So let's start first by looking at this classical theory of unemployment. The classical economists really focus on the long run. So if they're looking at real GDP over time, what they're seeing is that long-term growth trend. And we've looked in previous levels at what's happened to real GDP over time, and we do see that long-term growth. So their focus is really on that long run and the fact that in the long run, you get mostly growth. Which means that as we look long-term, bigger picture, the economy will be at full employment. Now, do you remember, what does it mean to be at full employment? Remember, full employment means that you're at the natural rate of unemployment, or that we have zero cyclical unemployment. So long term, we don't have to worry about those business cycles, those ups and downs. Over the long term, we're going to see growth, and the unemployment rate is going to return to its natural or full employment rate, which remember is about 4 to 6.4% unemployment depending on which country you're in. And that 4 to 6.4% range, you recall, was because there are different definitions within countries of what it means to be in the labor force and what it means to be unemployed. So when we look at the classical view of unemployment, that bigger picture about growth, we don't have to worry so much about cyclical unemployment. The economy is going to fix itself, so we don't really have to worry about intervening. And the classical theory really ties in with that philosophy of that laissez-faire competition economy. That is, the government is hands-off, the economy will fix itself. And the reason the economy will fix itself is because wages and prices are flexible. So if we allow wages and prices to change, the economy will fix itself. So let's look at how the economy can fix itself. How does it get into a situation and how does it bounce back? And you can see in the other video in this level that it's kind of like a punching bag or a seesaw where the economy bounces back. So let's walk through that a bit. So the classical economists are looking at the cause of high unemployment, of cyclical unemployment, is caused by a decrease in demand. When there's less demand for goods, well, here's demand, here's supply. When there's a decrease in demand for goods, that means that prices of goods are going to fall. Well, if there's a decrease in demand for goods, that also means we don't need to make as many goods and people get laid off. So when that demand goes down, we're also seeing higher unemployment. So if we have higher unemployment, that means that when businesses are looking for workers, they now have lots of people to choose from. Well, if you have lots of workers to choose from, how do you decide who to hire? You hire the best worker for the least amount of money. So when the unemployment rate goes up, because of that lots of choice on who to hire, It's actually going to drive down wages. Well, if wages fall, workers are now cheaper, and that means businesses can now afford to hire more. And that means that your unemployment rate that was high is going to fall back down. So you can see the fact that wages are flexible allows the economy to bounce back. Like a punching bag, it swings back. Higher unemployment led to lots of choice on who to hire. It made wages fall. Now we can hire more, and that means the unemployment rate falls. Well, when demand decreases and prices of goods fall, we have deflation. Well, what does that do to interest rates? Remember that Fisher effect? What did the Fisher effect say? The Fisher effect said there was a relationship between inflation and interest rates. And when there's deflation, interest rates will go down. When there's inflation, when you expect there to be higher prices, remember you have to make the person who lent you the money whole. And so in order to make sure the money you give them back buys what they could have bought before you borrowed the money, then they charge you a higher interest rate. So prices go up, interest rates go up, prices go down, interest rates go down. When interest rates go down, well, now it's cheaper to borrow money. So we're going to borrow more. And if we're borrowing more money, we're now going to spend more. So if we're borrowing more, that demand is going to go back up. So it's this flexibility in prices. The fact that the prices go up and down as demand changes allows the economy to bounce back. So the classical theory says we really don't need any government intervention. The economy will fix itself because wages and prices are flexible. So what is causing this problem? Why would we get into a recession to start with? So if the economy just bounces back on its own over time, how come we end up in a recession? Well, here we have demand and we have supply for workers. And here we have equilibrium. But if we're not in equilibrium, for example, if wages are high, then we're above that equilibrium point. And so the quantity supplied, that's the number of people who want to work, is more than the quantity demanded. That is the number of people businesses want to hire. So if quantity supplied is more than quantity demanded, then what we have is we have a surplus. And since this is the market for workers, for labor, we have a surplus of workers. This is the unemployed. Well, if there's a lot of people who are unemployed, then now there's lots of competition, right, to get those jobs. And so the fact that businesses now have lots of choice is going to make wages fall and we end back at equilibrium. You could look at this the other way. If wages are too low, then businesses want to hire a lot of people, so quantity demanded is high, but quantity supplied, the amount of people who want to work at that low wage, is much lower. So there's a shortage of workers. And if there's a shortage of workers, then that means for your business, you can't find enough workers because this is how many workers you want and this is how many people want to work at that wage. So you can't find enough workers. Well, if you can't find enough workers, how do you keep the good ones? You got to pay them more. And so if there's a shortage of workers, it drives up the price until we end up back at equilibrium. So when we talk about high unemployment, it's because wages are too high. And if we're talking about unemployment that's fallen below that full employment rate, then it's because wages are too low. And if you give the economy enough time, because prices and wages are flexible, that adjustment will put us right back at equilibrium and our high cyclical or unemployment or that recession will just go away. So according to the classical economist, the reason that we have a high unemployment is because wages are just too high. Well, in order for this to work, it's all premised on what's called Say's law. So Say's law is the very basis of the classical theory. And Say's law has been attributed to a French economist named Jean-Baptiste Say, but it wasn't really him who came up with it. They don't know who really did, so they call it Say's law after this gentleman. And the idea of Say's law, well, to quote Say's law, supply creates its own demand. We got to be careful about that, because as we learned in a previous level, there are 6 things that change supply, and none of them were demand. There are 6 things that change demand, and none of them are supply. So it's not that a change in supply shifts the demand curve, or a change in demand shifts the supply curve. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is that companies make goods and services. And when they do so, they need the factors of production. What are the 4 factors of production? Land, labor, capital, and enterprise. So they need the land, labor, capital, and enterprise to make their goods and services. Well, how do they get those factors of production? Well, they buy the land, the labor, they buy capital, they buy all these from households, right? They hire workers. Well, that means workers are getting money. They're getting income. They're getting those factor payments. What were those factor payments? How do we pay for land? Rent. How do we pay for labor? Wages. How do we pay for capital? Interest. And how do we reward entrepreneurs? Rent. So it's wages, interest, rent, and profits, those factor payments, that become income for households. Well, what do households do with this money? They use the money they get to buy goods and services. And they buy those goods and services from businesses. So this should really sound familiar. It should sound like that circular flow we talked about earlier this semester. And so the classical view of economics says the economy will bounce back because we have this flow of money and goods through our economy, which are allowing the prices and the wages to adjust. Well, this was the predominant theory until the Great Depression. And the problem with the Great Depression is that, well, we kept waiting for the economy to bounce back, and instead things just kept getting worse and worse. So let's look at the theory that arose from the Great Depression.